I have a confession to make. I used to be a power gamer that couldn't care less about role-playing in TTRPGs.
You what?
Back in the halcyon days of Dungeons & Dragons 3.5 edition, I got into the hobby after feeling like I didn't have real nerd cred unless I played D&D. Without any background in other tabletop role-playing games, I went straight into running my first campaign, and I was a god's awful dungeon master. My players endured everything from poorly balanced encounters, railroaded plots, but most egregiously, they faced an adversarial relationship with their dungeon master. Coming from the world of competitive video game nights and the querulousness you can only find in someone going through a testosterone-fueled puberty, it seemed only natural that you had two sides, the players and the dungeon master, and the players needed to know their place. An absurd thing to think, given what I espouse these days, but it is true. Despite all this, we carried on since we didn't know any better. I mean, the evil DM trope is something that permeates nerd culture pretty much any time Dungeons & Dragons is mentioned. Dexter's Laboratory wouldn't steer us wrong, would it?
49! You are fried! You eat your lose? 20 life points!
When I finally got the chance to hang up my DM cloak, yes, I did in fact have an actual cloak to wear while DMing, I got to experience the other side of Dungeons & Dragons, being a player and crafting my very first OC Do Not Steal character. So naturally, looking at the options as an edgy teenager, you will never guess what I picked. It most certainly was not a rogue, and they most certainly and definitely were not a loner that would do anything for power and riches while living by their own selfish whims. Rest in peace, Damien Darkwell, you are not missed. In the end, I didn't care about Damien's story because what mattered to me was just how many dice I could roll for that sweet sneak attack damage. Clearly, combat was the only thing that really mattered. After all, so much of the book is dedicated to that facet of the game. So Damien was a walking shredder, unmoored from the story to any significant extent beyond when the Dungeon Master would jingle the shiny keys of magic items to get his attention, while cutting down everything in his path with one improved feint at a time. The first time I learned there was such a thing as other tabletop role-playing games, it was when someone from the playgroup came in clutching a strange-looking book. It was green marble with a photorealistic rose. It was Vampire the Masquerade. The pitch was simple. Vampire clans living, or rather not living, in the modern day. It was dark, it was edgy, it was catnip to an angst-riddled youth. I devoured the book and loved every second of reading it. I couldn't wait for the day we were going to play this game. And then that day came. And it was an abject failure. Everyone bounced off the system within the first hour. That was because Vampire the Masquerade is a highly narrative system. It's meant to be full of intrigue and schemes, political maneuvering, subterfuge. We treated it like it was D&D. However, unlike D&D, fighting in Vampire the Masquerade is normally a very bad idea. Our vampires got rendered into undead mincemeat by a band of Setite assassins. Between the insatiable jonesing for a fight and being completely deaf to the expectations of roleplay in the system, it was doomed. Dungeons & Dragons had taught us that combat should be done early and often, and everything else was secondary. So everything changed when the Fire Nation, when we discovered Shadowrun. The setting of Shadowrun was an instant sell for me. A cyberpunk world that also has magic, I could not be more sold on a setting. In Shadowrun, you play criminals who conduct illegal operations on behalf of clients who will pay and more than likely backstab you for good measure. Think cyberpunk edge runners, but instead of only worrying that your cyberware is going to be hacked, you also have to be concerned there's a mage ready to boil your blood. In a very literal fashion. This was a whole new chapter for role-playing. The framing of the game was such a radical departure from Dungeons & Dragons that we no longer felt bound to the suppositions we had about what a role-playing game must be, while still maintaining enough familiarity of mechanics that it wasn't totally relearning the fundamentals from scratch. Combat was still an inextricable part of the game, and the system still fleshed it out into a specific turn-based encounter, but gone was the need for a battle map. No more were mage's spells measured in 30-foot cones, but in general, line of sight. While guns do have ranges, it was enough to apply distance bands rather than exact spacing. One of Shadowrun's strongest features, though, was in its tone. From the short stories, including the rulebook, to the myriad gadgets you can buy during character creation that make you feel like a real spy, every step puts you in the mindset of preparing for your big moment in the spotlight during a heist film. This gets mechanically reinforced further with the array of social and technical skills perfect for getting into your role and knowing exactly what your character is good at when they aren't trying to turn the enemy into chunky salsa. People who previously stumbled through the simplest of role-playing to try and get to the killing faster suddenly were hyper-invested in their characters. People were sending in-character emails between sessions to learn more about the mystery behind the plot or interact with their contact. Coincidentally, this is also when we probably landed ourselves on at least one list after a very in-depth, in-character email exchange about purchasing a second-hand military-grade sniper rifle. People were truly enthusiastic about their characters for the first time as they understood their place in the world. Shadowrun also has a contacts system where each player receives a certain amount of points to create NPCs that are some combination of loyal to the player and influential to the world. No longer were characters untethered from the world with dead parents and destroyed villages. There was an anchoring into the setting that gave stakes that could be threatened or narrative threads that could be explored separate from just the main mission of the campaign. Shadowrun was a crucial step in deprogramming the biases given by our Dungeons & Dragons education. It was then time to unveil the next big step in the party's tabletop roleplay gaming education. It was time for Blades in the Dark. This was a brand new system on the scene and a radical departure from all the biases we had known up to that point. It was also the most openly cinematic system we had experienced. It encouraged you to think in terms of being in a movie. My first campaign of Blades in the Dark was framed as if it were the first season of a new show. The players were the actors, each session an episode. It didn't take long before the phrase, "the camera sees," inserted itself into common parlance around the table. Everyone felt for the first time they were truly playing a role. Not only was the framing incredibly effective at shifting people's perception for the role in the game, but mechanically it also used novel mechanics to recontextualize conflict. Blades in the Dark tracks conflicts via its clock system. When there is an impending goal that is too complicated to be resolved by a singular die roll, then a clock is created. It's a tracker with a certain amount of segments, usually ranging from 4 to 10, depending on the complexity of the task. This mechanic contextualizes non-combat action sequences in a structured manner while leaving immense agency to the players as to the best way to achieve their goals. This gives the acts of escaping from a burning building, running someone down with a high-speed wagon chase through the city, or sneaking into the noble's manor as much nuance as would normally be reserved only for combat in other systems. The idea of recontextualizing combat as one possible consequence or avenue of choices a character encounters rather than the ultimate goal was revolutionary for the table. That wasn't the biggest change that the system imposed, however. The single most important decision was that experience gain was separated from the idea of combat. No longer was defeating enemies the same as beating an experience point piñata. Instead, experience points are gained from role-playing one's character as well as making the story more interesting. You see, Blades in the Dark uses a fascinating system of narrative positioning and effect. The narrative position shows how much danger a given character is in during their role. Thus, the consequences of failure vary dependent on the narrative position. So, someone trying to convince a friend to give them some information, that might be a controlled situation. However, trying to destroy a guard tower as your nemesis bears down on you, that's a desperate action for sure. Desperate actions are cinematic and put the character at risk, but in exchange, they grant experience whenever they're rolled. Each class also has a series of questions that ask at the end of each session which can grant experience. For example, the Charismatic Slide class asks whether challenges were addressed with deception or influence. As this question asks for different means for each class, this immediately gives stakes to the role-playing as characters want to jockey for approaching conflict with their speciality in order to gain experience. The other two questions are the same for every class and ask whether you expressed your character's beliefs, drives, heritage, or background during the session, and if you struggled with issues from your vice or trauma. In short, every character has a vice that they use during the course of the game to ward off accumulated stress from the struggles of being a criminal. Obviously, each of these questions, though, make you first need to know what your beliefs, drives, heritage, and background are. There's a magical moment when a person is asked that question for the first time and they stop to earnestly consider what their character's beliefs are. With a setup like this, the character taking risks and role-playing is rewarded while Johnny McStabface, the zero roleplay murder machine, receives less to no experience. People loved the campaign. People that a few years prior would be in a group of murder hobos now carefully considered their character's motivations, and even the shyest of players had come out of their shell to really start role-playing their characters. The next system I introduced everyone to turned all of these good features of Blades in the Dark to their logical endpoints. I speak, of course, of Burning Wheel. To burn or create a character in Burning Wheel is to make a character that is already intrinsically tied into the fabric of the world and interrogate their beliefs. Unlike other systems that focuses almost entirely on your class with perhaps a vague nod to some background your character may have, such as the background system found in Dungeons & Dragons, or the slightly more fleshed out version found in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, Burning Wheel asks where your character has been from their birth. Characters are generated by selecting a certain number of life paths, which start literally from the conditions around birth, such as village-born or noble-born, and then walking the web of possibilities. Rather than deciding you're a level 5 priest and have some set of skills, you instead know your character was a city-born child that spent 4 years as a rabble-rousing student, for all students are rabble-rousers because the author of Burning Wheel seemingly hates children almost as much as I do. The character then shipped off to be a temple acolyte for 5 years before finally becoming a real priest. This process makes your character feel far more fleshed out, as you watch them pick up potential character quirks, skills, and traits each step of the way. Similarly to both Shadowrun and Blades in the Dark, Burning Wheel also has a contact system, allowing you to bring useful or interesting characters into the story, which serves to further add bonds to a character and make them feel more integrated into the world they're in. Blades in the Dark asks the person to interrogate what their beliefs, drives, heritage are, but in Burning Wheel, a character's beliefs and instincts are core parts of the mechanical reinforcement intrinsic to the system. Each player has to come up with 3 beliefs and instincts as guiding principles for their character. Asking towards these beliefs grant the currency used to augment die rolls necessary to achieve success and eventually level up. But the genius of Burning Wheel's skill and leveling system is the topic for another video. Regardless, in Burning Wheel, rather than a subtextual question that gets brought up at the end, beliefs are now at the forefront of your mind during the game, putting you squarely into your character's headspace. People were now constantly considering how decisions might align to their character's beliefs, and they were happy to allow complications to arise due to their instincts, since they were rewarded for this. Instead of complications arising and the story being seen as a failure state, they were now met with cheers. Never before were people so invested in their characters as they had nuanced contacts, mechanical reinforcement towards their roleplay, and a robust social system to back up the narrative structure when socializing. From Burning Wheel, I've considered branching out to other systems. I've always been on the hunt for another novel system and something that will change my perspective on role-playing as much as the clock system from Blades in the Dark did. There are 3 systems I'm currently writing campaign pitches to eventually run as future games. The first is Exalted, a system where you play as beings uplifted by the gods of the world to be a demigod meets superhero that is capable of superhuman acts. It also has a richly deep yet cinematic combat system that uniquely separates your attacks into withering and decisive blows, where the former is meant to wear down your opponent and decisive attacks are the major strikes that matter in the fight. These can be thought of as when a strike turns on the pressurized blood fountain during an anime fight scene. Exalted can support anything from a shonen action arc to deep roleplay narrative involving the securing of municipal rights for the undead after one day that they begin to arise, or a classic political thriller intrigue campaign. The second system is Brinkwood, Blood of the Tyrants, a Forged in the Dark game, where the players are fomenting a rebellion against vampire nobles. It builds on the base Forged in the Dark system, adding a fascinating twist, granting the players masks that contain special powers, gifts of the Fae, as additional tools to use during a single adventure. A given mask can be used by different players session to session, but the skills allocated largely stay the same, allowing for the building up of lore and memorable moments for these masks at the table. Finally, but certainly not least, is Torchbearer. This is for everyone who wonders what a non-D&D dungeon crawl game would look like. It uses Burning Wheel's core system to create nuanced and interesting characters that you're about to put through the ringer. Since a big focus on Torchbearer is the grinding down of resolve of your fresh-faced adventurer, as they become exhausted, hungry, and had their only lantern stolen by goblins. Think of it like Darkest Dungeon, the TTRPG, and I cannot wait to run it someday. All of this is a fraction of the systems I've experienced, but these were the most influential ones on my journey. Leave my power gaming roleplay behind and learn to love role-playing. Did you follow a similar journey to me? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. If you want to try getting away from the path of the power gamer, I suggest giving something like Blades in the Dark or Burning Wheel a read. You never know where you'll end up.